Good morning, everybody. My name is Clark Miller, and I'm a professor in the School for the Future of Innovation and Society at Arizona State University. Today's video, I want to explore the question why there are so many different ways of knowing in research. And along the way, we're going to also begin to look at the question of how do we design ways of knowing, and particularly focus on the question of how do we design research methods to answer the questions that we have. So pretty important set of topics today, obviously just a beginning of an attempt to answer some of those questions, but looking forward to having a conversation with you about them. So in elementary school and often in high school, we often get given a very standardized picture of the scientific method. Question, hypothesis, experiment, data, as if there's a single way that one goes about answering questions in science and in research more generally. And in popular discourse about science, we often hear this model of the scientific method being described frequently as well. But when we start to look in detail at how scientists actually do science, what we find is a huge proliferation of different ways of knowing, not only in the sciences themselves, but in the social sciences, in the humanities, in engineering. It often seems as if everybody is constantly doing something different. Interestingly, science goes through periodic fads, if you will, where people spend a lot of time saying we need to figure out how to standardize all of our methods, or how to, make our methods more rigorous so that we make sure we get exact truth coming out of them. But those periods rarely last very long. The reason is because we need lots and lots and lots of different kinds of research methods in order to be able to answer different kinds of research questions. So to explore this a little more deeply, I want to introduce today something that I've come up with called QOD. And QOD is at the heart of research methods. And QOD is very simple, and it stands for question, object, data. And the point is that in order to do research well, in order to get answers to questions that are, reasonable, good approximations for good answers, that generate knowledge that we can use, you have to align these three things. You have to align what you're trying to figure out, that question, whether it's a research question or just a question that you're trying to figure out the answer to, with the object of study, right? So you got to be asking a question about something, right? It's not an abstract question, it's a question about something. So what is that object of study? And then you got to go get some data, some evidence, some insights, whatever you want to call this, right? People often think about quantitative data, but that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about any kind of information, data, evidence, insights that can help you answer your question about your object, right? And so when we talk about method in the sciences, in the social sciences, you often get all these things, these labels thrown at you, uh, like ethnography or statistics, right? And you say, well, I'm going to use statistics to answer my question. I'm going to use ethnography to answer my question. Well, no, right? Those labels are relatively meaningless in the sense that they give you a kind of general orientation, but uh, they don't tell you what you're actually going to do when you go out into the field and start trying to figure out the answer to your research question. For that, you got to know what data are you actually going to go get, right? And about what object are you going to go get that data? And if those don't line up with your question, then whatever you find out won't answer your question, right? And so this triangle is what you have to align at the heart of research methods in order to get good answers, right? You got to figure out what your question is, you got to figure out what your object of study is, and you got to figure out what data you're going to collect about that object of study in order to answer the question. These three have to align, and that's why I make them as a triangle, and that's this idea of QOD. And this is not easy. And this is not easy because there's no preordained mechanism for doing this alignment. There's no shortcut to doing the work of making the three things align. So let me give you an example of how QOD works. So suppose you have a question. How many children do humans have? It's a relatively simple and straightforward question, right? And one that has some potential interest, maybe to a biologist, maybe to a sociologist, maybe to an anthropologist. There might be all kinds of people who are interested in the question, how many children do humans have? But even a little bit of thought will immediately start to raise questions about this question, like, well, which humans? Do we mean children who live to a certain age, like adulthood, or do we just mean children number of births, or even the number of conceptions, right? So you gotta actually get your question sorted out, right? What do you mean? And to do that, you have to start thinking about your object of study. What is your object of study? So, let's offer up an object of study here, and then we'll evolve this conversation a little bit as we go forward. But let's offer up U.S. families, right? And so we can say, well, how many children on average exist within a U.S. family? So we take as a family, a constellation of adults who are in relationship with one another, and we ask, how many children does that family have? Okay, so it's a plausible, both question and research object or object of study. And then, although obviously, in American politics in the 21st century, the question of what counts as a family is on the table. So we can already also begin asking questions about the object. So we got to figure out what is that object that we're looking at, right? And then it turns out that the U.S. Census, in their regular surveying of U.S. households, ask questions about the number of children who are living in each household, right? So they have a particular definition of household, they have a particular definition of children, and so they collect a bunch of data, and so we could use that data to begin answering questions about how many children US households have, which begins to orient us a little bit around a QOD constellation, right? So how many children do humans have? But we figured out that we need to narrow that down. So we're going to say families or households in the United States, and we're going to explore that by using data associated with the US Census survey of households. Okay, so that's an example of aligning a QOD constellation, and it's going to tell us some things that might be of interest in answering our big overarching research question, but it's not going to tell us everything, and there's some caveats that we've already identified that are associated with it. But suppose that we then said, well, yeah, but US households are US households. And maybe there's something about US households or US families that's different from others. So maybe we should ask this question in general about all families. So we say, what if our object is global families, right? That would give us a different answer, potentially at least, to this question about how many children humans have. And obviously, we can no longer use the US Census survey of households to give us an answer to this question because it doesn't provide us with data about global families, right? And so we have to do some sort of different exercise, data collection exercise. So we need an international survey of households in order to answer the question of how many children humans have, where our object of study is now global families, right? But if we do that international survey of households, that actually allows us not only to ask our original question, how many children do humans have, we could get an average for all humans on the planet, all households on the planet, by doing this international survey, assuming we can get a representative sample of households surveyed from different parts of the globe. But that would also allow us to ask a question, do families in different countries have different numbers of children? Right? It would allow us to begin to do some comparative research, not just get a global average, but also find out, is that average different, or is the distribution, standard deviation, for example, of those family sizes, is that different from country to country? Maybe countries aren't the right population to be doing this subsample of, but they're one, and there's a lot of comparative cross-national research of this kind, right? And so now we've got a different alignment. We've got a different question, a different object of study, and a different data set that we're going to use to answer that question. But they align again, right? They still align, right? So suppose we do that, and suppose we find that different families in different countries, on average, have different numbers of children. An interesting outcome, which might then lead us to the question, why? Right? So now we have yet a third question potentially on the table. Why do families in different countries have different numbers of children? But now, right, just with an international survey of households in which we ask people, how many children do you have? It doesn't give us any insight into why they have different numbers of children in different countries on average, right? So now we need a different kind of data. We still need to look at global families, although maybe not in quite the same way. So now we need to look at cross-national families, right? We've got this data, we've got this insight now that we need to look at families in countries. Those are different than average families globally. So we need a different object of study, and we need a different method. So maybe, for example, we could do focus groups. Focus groups are where you get a group of people together in a room and you have a dialogue with the group, and the group, stimulates each other, and you can ask questions and get follow-ups and dig into meaning and the values that people have and the choices that they make, right? And so if we did that kind of focus group in each of the countries that we were looking at, and maybe we don't need all countries, right? If what we want to understand is why families in different countries have different numbers of children, maybe we only need to pick a few countries, some of which have lots of children, some of which have not so many children on average, and some of which have uh, an average number of children, right? And so we might compare 3 countries in this study. So now we don't have to do the whole world, but instead we're going to look at 3 countries, and we're going to compare families, and we're going to do these focus groups, 3 focus groups, 1 in each of these 3 countries, or maybe a few in each of these 3 countries in different communities within the countries, right, to explore this question, right? So again, Q, O, and D have aligned. We have a new question, we have a new object, and we have new data, right? But now we're doing focus groups instead of surveys, right? So we've got a different kind of inquiry that we're now doing, provides different kinds of insights to different kinds of problems. But, maybe somebody comes along and says, well, that's interesting that you're finding that people have different attitudes and different values, and they make different choices about the number of kids that they have in these different countries. But my suspicion is that there's something deeper that's underlying those choices that they're making. Right? My suspicion is maybe that it is about income, right? The more income a family has on average, the less they need to have kids working in working on behalf of the family in order to secure income. Or maybe it's about disease risk and health. Maybe the healthier the country is, the less risk there is of children dying when they're young. And so the less need there is for families to have children. And those aren't things that necessarily would come up in a conversation, but we could see them if we looked at structural factors in the society and the economy that might influence childbearing. And we did a comparative analysis of those different socioeconomic forces across countries. We looked at income, we looked at health in countries, and we correlated those with the number of children in families, right? So again, QOD align. We're still asking the question, why do families in different countries have different numbers of children? But now we're looking for a different kind of answer because we're looking at a different object of study. Instead of wanting to know how the family is making choices, we're now interested in what are the deep structures of the society and the economy and how those influence human behavior, right? And so now we need a new method. We need some kind of comparative analytic method that will allow us to collect data on those social and economic forces across countries versus just collecting data on families and their beliefs and their attitudes, right? So again, QOD align, but now it's a different kind of alignment, right? And so this is that illustration of how and why we might see a lot of different ways of knowing evolve around research, because we ask different kinds of questions. We believe in different kinds of theories of causation that underlie those research questions, and we're able to collect different kinds of data using different kinds of data collection and data analytic approaches, right? So let me also offer up here one other observation about what we've just seen, and that is that what we've just seen is what we call a research conversation, right? And this kind of research conversation is absolutely critical for figuring out how to do research or to design knowledge systems that make contributions to this kind of conversation, right? So this conversation started with a question about the size of US families. And maybe there was a research study done that analyzed that. And then somebody said, well, okay, but we should also look elsewhere, right? If you really want to know the size of the number of children that humans have, then you need to look more broadly than just US families, right? So that was a correction. Or a contribution that added to the conversation. Conversation started with US families, but now it's looking internationally at all families, right? And then somebody else came along and said, well, wait a minute. If you look at the data here, you don't just see that there's an average family size for all humans. You see that there's systematic patterns of variation within the data that allow you to say something about the relative size of families across countries, right? So they've made a contribution to the conversation. The conversation has evolved. It's gone in a new direction. It's now answering and new questions and observing new things in the world, right? And from that, then, somebody else came along and said, well, that's an interesting observation. Why did that happen? Why do we see different numbers of children in families in different countries? And they said, I'll tell you what, I'll go look at the decisions that families are making about whether to have kids or not, and I'll talk to them about it. And that'll give us, we'll be able to build a model that explains using decision-making factors why different family sizes occur across countries, right? And then somebody else says, well, wait a minute. Maybe it's not about families making decisions. Maybe it's about deeper structural factors in the society. It's about income or it's about health, right? So let's interrogate that question. Let's figure out whether there are deeper underlying factors that are influencing families and the decisions they're making. So this is a research conversation in which one research study generates insights that then give rise to other questions that others can go out and research, right? And one after the other, right? So this is just, it's an important illustration, because when you propose new research, or when you propose to design a new knowledge system, right? You're designing it so that it can make a contribution, so that it can answer a question that hasn't been answered before on the one hand, but that makes a contribution to a conversation that's already going on of some sort in a way that makes it important, right? Because when we do research, we don't want to just answer questions. We want to answer important questions. And conversations give us the foundation for the intellectual importance of a question. There's another kind of importance, which is societal importance, right? So it's important on the one hand to research if it's contributing to research conversations. It's important to society if it's contributing to social conversations, conversations about policy or conversations about like the economy, right? Other things that are important to society. So there's two different kinds of importance to any research study. It's research importance or research significance, and it's social importance or social significance. All right, so to sum up this video, ways of knowing proliferate. We get lots of ways of knowing, and they proliferate, in fact, quite rapidly because different questions and different objects of study require different methods of data collection and analysis. QOD alignment, right? You've got to align those things. And so if you shift up the question, you got to shift up the kind of data that you collect in order to answer that question. If you shift up the object of study, you shift up the kind of data that you collect. You maybe also have to shift the kind of question that you ask, right? So in shifting, you're forcing ways of knowing then to evolve. So the second reason that ways of knowing proliferate is because research conversations evolve over time, branching off into new directions. And those new directions often require us to make advances in methodology in order to answer that. They require us to realign our QODs. And then finally, right, specialized subfields evolve around different QOD conversations. So if we go back quickly, well, let's go to this one, right? If we go back to this thing, right, there may be people who get really interested in the question of the size of human families here, right? This part of the research conversation. They may take it off over here and they may do all kinds of analyses on that. And they may start, asking certain kinds of questions and developing certain kinds of data sets and all that kind of stuff, right? Whereas another group might get people might get interested in these structural models for explaining the relative size of families. And in fact, they might get so interested in this that they stop being interested in the size of families at all. And they really just focus on the structural model for explaining various things that differ from one country to the next. And they may get really sophisticated in how they explore these structural models of explanation for cross-national difference, right? And so those subfields evolve and focus on particular areas of work. And that's where you begin to evolve from having a particular QOD configuration to having really a way of knowing in that subfield because they specialize and they reinforce and they develop particular ways of doing things in terms of data collection. Then they can come to expect certain things as normal within that little subfield, and that's where you can evolve a kind of more systematic or more standardized way of knowing for a particular subfield. All right, with that, thank you very much, and I'll look forward to seeing you in the next video.